Still working in Just and Unjust Wars, Part 2, The Theory of Aggression, Chapter 7, Wars Ends and the Importance of Winning. This is the second video on Chapter 7. And once I finish this video, that brings us to the end of Part 2. Now, what's going on here? Well, we ended the last video by looking at Walzer's claim that, we're moral creatures, of course, and we want to look at the ends of war, like what are the goals? And what are we talking about with justice in war? We're starting to think more about it. And how are we going to do that? We're going to look more at the concept of winning, right? And remember, all of this is within the concept of human beings as being moral creatures that, always look for meaning. We look for some kind of justification when it comes to killing. War is this massive killing enterprise, so it's got to be meaningful. And what underpins the notion of just war is that indeed there are things that are worth dying for. And if you disagree with that, if you think there's nothing worth dying for, that violence and all that stuff is never the answer, that's fine. But that's another position. That's more like pacifism, or in a sense, perhaps you could make an argument for realism on that. But Walzer's saying no. There is a goal of war, and sometimes we are willing, and we should even pay for it in human lives. If there's no other means available, of course, right? That's where the obligation comes from. All right, so go back to the previous video and work through that to go into a little bit more detail of what I just did as a brief sort of overview. Now, let's look a little bit at winning. Some cases, like World War II, fighting the Nazi regime, this is a regime that shocks the conscience of mankind, that kind of thinking where it's a total aberration. Or maybe not completely unique, however you want to put it, but it certainly is something that is absolutely opposed to, decent human and moral values and whatnot. And Walzer doesn't, again, he didn't go down into philosophy's basement. He doesn't do that, but he is kind of presupposing that some regimes can, in fact, be absolutely antithetical to reasonable moral positions. And so the Nazi regime was like that, and there's only one way to deal with it, and that is to deal with an extreme, kind of entity like a Nazi Germany. You have to have an extreme response, unconditional surrender. Like there's no negotiation, nothing. This regime has to be completely dismantled. That its perpetrators, its organizers, its leaders have to be rounded up, put on trial. And justice is served in that matter. Complete dismantling of this state. So, and that's justifiable, right? That's a just war. Its consequence, its goal will be unconditional surrender. But that's only some cases. That's not all the time. So, and why is that? Because even if you fight for absolute moral principles and justice, it doesn't follow that you're going to fight in the same way or to the exact same end, right? We're fighting for justice, whether we fight against a Nazi Germany or, as he thought, partly in this Korean war, still fighting for something, but we're not going to fight to the exact same degree. So you could fight, unlike this case, where it's unconditional sort of extreme end, you could fight for limited ends. And again, have a look at Walzer's discussion, very interesting, of the Korean War, a war that we don't often talk as much about today, but certainly Walzer uses it to illustrate, that winning, again, kind of think of it as a genus with various species, winning in a certain species was, well, okay, against Nazi Germany. So that's what it's going to look like there. It's going to look different in a different context. Now, just as a quick aside, to sort of, kind of sum up what Walzer's after in this chapter, like all chapters, there's way more going on than I'm talking about, but here's the gist of it as I see it. Walzer says that on the domestic level, please think about a police force when they find some criminal activity. Yes, first off, they want to stop the criminal activity, but they don't just stop the criminal activity and then leave things there. Like, okay, people are stealing stuff, so we make it where they can't steal anymore. No, there is a quote unquote kind of roundup. You don't just stop the criminal activity and restore the previous situation. No, you round up and punish the criminals. So there's like a mopping up operation afterwards. You know, you stop the criminal activity, and then you get the people that were responsible for it, and you deal with them that way. In a sense, you dismantle. It's always the reaction of you dismantle the criminal organization. You round it up. You round up its perpetrators. You dismantle it. You break. Essentially, you break it. It's kind of like this. There's, you know, it's an unconditional surrender. You don't make peace with criminal organizations. Well, technically, you're not supposed to. Maybe cops do in some cases. Whatever. But in theory, that's not what they do. They go after them. They try to dismantle them, break them, and do the roundup. Okay, that's on the domestic level. Now, Walzer says that this doesn't really hold on the international level, except in these cases, like a Nazi state or whatever, where it's just this state in no sense can be allowed to exist. Well, states are collectivist entities, right? There's all kinds of things involved, and this is why we don't have graduated notions of aggression, right? So go back to those early videos. But think about the concept of roundup in a state's activities on the international level. When a state does something and there's a response to its aggression or whatever, should it always be the way that you respond to domestic crime rings? Like, is there an analogy between an aggressor state that holds, that is, that we want to move how we deal with a criminal organization inside a state to saying, oh yeah, an aggressor state, all aggressor states are just like criminal organizations, and how we deal with the ones internal, the criminal organization, is exactly the way we're going to deal with all aggressor states. Well, think about it. What you're doing then is you're saying, oh yeah, apply the roundup idea. So to a collectivist entity like a state, you're going to always apply the roundup. Well, what does that mean? What is that going to entail? Well, the roundup of the aggressors, what's that going to entail when it's a state? Well, it's always going to pretty well, most often, he says, Walzer says, require a military conquest. And conquest has effects that reach far beyond the people who are rounded up. Right? So usually, if you're rounding up the bad guys in a criminal organization, usually you're not going to catch a lot of innocent people in the crossfire. Well, you try not to. Of course, it happens. But remember, we're talking kind of theoretically here. But if you try and take over an aggressor state, right? If we're going to round the whole thing up. This is like, we're going to completely dismantle this state. You're going to catch, because of the collectivist nature of the state, you're going to catch all kinds of people in that rounding up, that mopping up operation, right? So what happens? So it has effects that reach far beyond the people who are rounded up. It prolongs, this rounding up on a state level prolongs a war in which large numbers of innocent men and women are virtually certain to die. And it puts a whole nation, as we have seen, right? So he's in the Korean story, so go back and read that. But it puts the whole nation under a kind of, under political tutelage. It does this even if its methods are democratic, free elections, and all that kind of thing, because it replaces a regime which the people of the conquered nation had not themselves sought to replace. So you're putting the whole nation under a new kind of regime. And indeed, many of them may have fought for that regime and died for it, and so you're imposing another regime on them. So again, there's kind of a little bit of the moral equivalence of soldiers going on here. So you can think about that. So, and again, Walzer reiterates, unless it's been a regime that kind of shocks the conscience, like of the Nazis, unless it's like that, unless it's like a Nazi state. This sort of roundup analogy with the domestic with domestic issues like police forces doesn't really apply. Now, he goes on to discuss, how does this relate to proportionality, etc. So you can have a look at that. But he says we've got another modification of our legalist paradigm. So remember, a couple of chapters ago, he articulated this legalist paradigm. There's about 6 propositions, and he's been kind of tinkering and modifying them as we go along. And we've had 4 of them. Go back to previous videos and the text, refresh your memory. Here's our 5th one. Basically, just wars, get used to it. They're rather conservative in nature, unless you're dealing with Nazi-like states. When you're dealing like with the War, you know, there's an invasion, you tend to push the aggressor out. You don't necessarily go and completely want to take over the aggressor state and have a regime, as we would say today. Walzer doesn't use this term, but oh no, every response to an aggressor has to be regime change in the aggressor state. He's trying to push back. That's too extreme of a reaction, and that puts you know, oh well, we're fighting for moral principles, so we always fight it in the exact same end to achieve that moral principle. Oh, there's aggression. Oh well, the answer is always you know, a deconstruction or a destruction of the aggressor's state and the imposition of something new. Well, yeah, in this case, Nazi Germany case, yeah, but that's a particular case. We fight for limited ends, and in general, just wars tend to be rather conservative in nature, that we're just trying to go back to the getting things to the previous situation, and not trying to completely eliminate the aggressor state. Anyway, so that's a rough overview of that chapter. You can dig in it further. There's always you know, more little nuggets in there that Walzer talks about, and you can dig into this one more because there's a more discussion of you know, things like, well, in war, there's no substitute for victory. You know, you hear that. There's nothing like victory. Well, sure, in a highly abstract sense, victory is victory and nothing else is. But again, let's keep in mind that, you know, winning is not a simple concept. It has various notions and subtleties to it. So while you could say on a very abstract level, there's nothing like victory, it still leaves open, like, what do you mean by victory? What do you mean by winning? All right, so that brings my discussion and lectures of part 2, the theory of aggression, to a close. And in the next video, we'll start with part 3 of Just and Unjust Wars. See you next video.